Welcome to the second part of the third module, where we try, as we said before, to understand from the past what in fact could be used in the future to solve the problem of reconstruction, if we can have a solution for it. So talking about the previous case study, this is a really brief overview of general data of the most severe Italian earthquake in the last century to understand what we have to look at. So the first thing is, when we think about these territories, is to look if the site, the location, geographical location, the physical location, if the site is temporary or is permanent, the future perspective of the communities, and also, third point, if there is any management of the reconstruction, but also of the prevention and emergency, if there are also parallel paths, not only of the reconstruction, but of urban policies and urban planning, urban design. And it will, let's say, affect how this reconstruction could affect the future Italian landscape. And also to look at the total cost of the earthquakes, it could be useful. So when we talk about the data of the earthquake, here there are just the most famous one that are from the second part of the 20th century to the beginning of this 21st century. The first was in Belice in 1968, the second in Friuli, the third in Puglia, then Umbria, Marche, Abruzzo, Emilia, and Central Italy. Here are the dates: almost 1968, Friuli 1976, Irpinia 80, Umbria, Marche 97, Abruzzo 2009, Emilia 2012, and Central Italy 2016. The magnitude went from 5.5 in a small area near L'Aquila in 2016 to 6.9 that was in Irpinia, one of the most destructive one. And if you would think about homeless, of course, the homeless are considered as the people that immediately after the quake, they have to leave their house. But it means that it doesn't mean that they have to stay out, because after the checking, some of them partially they could come back to their house. But we have really different numbers, from 70,000 of central of Italy to, let's say, the 280,000 of Irpinia. Then the buildings that were damaged or destroyed, we have different data, but as you can see, the numbers are important. From 7,700 of Emilia destroyed to really huge number, again, as Irpinia, that were severely damaged, 275,000. The affected population, again, is from small numbers like Central Italy, 25,000, to Irpinia, 6 million. For the affected population, we mean the large number, everybody that was touched, but event itself, because they lost job, they were destroyed, their activities, the houses were destroyed. So the affected population is in large number. The victims, the most severe was again in Irpinia, 2,000, almost 2,900 of deaths, and the less severe was in Marche, with 11 that injured. Affected areas, again, we have significant differences, but there is almost, we are talking about thousands of square kilometers. If we look to the industry damages, we do not have, it depends on the earthquake. And for instance, for Abruzzo and Belice, we do not have really detailed data, but we can see that in Friuli, the first where we were looking to the destroyed business and industry. It was really severe for 50% of the entire built industry. And we will see also the problem related with Emilia-Romagna, where we have one of the highest production of GDP, national GDP, that is almost in that area, those eaten by disaster, is produced at 2% of the entire national GDP. So agriculture, let me say that agriculture is something that is not often considered, but it has a lot of effects on the area where, for instance, like in the central Italy earthquake, but like in Friuli or in Belice, there is a large amount of the territory that is occupied by agricultural activity. So if we look at numbers in terms of reconstruction, I think is almost rhetorical to say how much is spent in the reconstruction works. But what is important is the site of reconstruction. In the village, they were relocated. In Friuli, it was in situ, so where it was as it was. In Irpinia, mixed. In Umbria, where it was as it was. In Abruzzo, mixed. Some there, some in other place. In Emilia, where it was as it was. In Central, it is still under construction, so it's difficult, but let's say mixed. The period of reconstruction in Belice, it was the end is previewed in 2028. In Friuli, the period of reconstruction officially is 30 years after, but in fact, after 10 years, almost everything was reconstructed. In Irpinia is ongoing, like in Belice. In Umbria and Marche, is previewed in 2024, but almost ended in 2004. In Abruzzo, we preview it will be over in 20 years, so in 2029. In Emilia, it's ongoing, and there are no provision of the period of reconstruction as it's in central Italy. Only two are completed, that is Friuli and Umbria Marche. Another interesting point is about participation. And participation actually was only in Emilia, and it was supported also by top-down activities like a regional law. In Abruzzo, there were no top-down, just some movement or spontaneous activity. In Friuli, there was participation was structured among the institutional level. What I mean is that it involved the different level of government. Let's say it was not top-down with the intermediate, the municipality that started reconstruction. And we had a lot of strong phenomena from bottom-up, spontaneous, but homogeneous activities of participation. There is the governance of reconstruction is almost on the hands of state. But in Umbria, Marche, in Friuli, in Emilia, it was more, there were more nuances. As I said, for instance, in Friuli, at a certain point, the main strategic level of reconstruction was the municipality as a body, that it was a sort of intermediate actor, but that the decision maker was there. Almost in Umbria Marche, it happened the same. In Emilia, the region has a strong role. As you can see here, if you compare the participation with the numbers of regulation and numbers of laws, you can understand that in Abruzzo, where you do not have any kind of participation, the number is really high, 224. Instead, in Emilia, it's just 4. In Friuli, just 7, and so on. So we have regular intervention tools. So it means that we're, decide beforehand. And there are spatial intervention tools that are regarding spatial program in the reconstruction. And we have in Friuli, in Abruzzo, and in Emilia. But in Emilia, we have also the model for buildings and the mood. And in Umbria Marche, we have only the regular intervention tool rather than something else. So, as we pointed out, there are no models that can be applied top-down to all the situation, not only because there are differences between casualties, magnitudes, damages, losses, etc. But we have to think about main criteria to look at. The one is to think about the level of innovation that can be introduced, that was introduced, that can stimulate or is stimulated by the event itself. If we have cooperation between different levels of planning and decision-making process, if we have a certain level of participation, doesn't matter where and how, but there is a participation at least, it's not purely top-down. And another thing that we have to think is that if we do not know, we have no knowledge of what was the status quo of the system at the moment of dramatic event, we were going to face really, really different and severe problems. We need, anyhow, the experience shows us that we need a new way. And a new way to conceive and to a new concept to look at reconstruction and rebuilding. First of all, is we are aware that we have to work really deeply on prevention rather than the emergency, because of course it's important, the emergency plan are crucial, vital, but it's important to work on prevention. And we have to think to frame further policies for all the country, but keeping in mind that we have a country that is suffering of multi-hazard. Some small description about the event that I already showed to you. This is the Friuli earthquake and the 6th of May in 1976, about 9 p.m. An earthquake of 6.4 on the Richter scale destroyed partly the Friuli Venezia region. It includes 137 municipalities, 45 of which were devastated, 40 seriously damaged, and 52 damaged. And the population affected, as I showed you before, was about 600,000 of inhabitants. There were almost 1,000 dead and 3,000 injured and 100,000 homeless. It was dramatic because there were no electricity. We were in 1976, so no internet, no mobiles, nothing. But there were no electricity, no water, communication was completely broke down, and the 40% of the building near to the center were completely destroyed. The major damage were also in the infrastructure and also economically, from economically point of view, 15,000 of jobs were lost due to the severe damages. But also, from the historical heritage point of view, we had really a strong and severe effects from the collapse of the Cathedral of Enzone, that was a sort of iconic symbol of the area, to the Castle of Prampero, the small one. What was the immediate reaction? The immediate reaction was the slogan. The slogan then was important, even if it was unrealistic, because it was Fasin di Pessoy, let's do by ourselves alone. It was a word, it was not exactly a model. In 1977, 400 temporary villages were set up, 90,000 of homeless people were housed in 25,000 homes. That slogan, from tents to houses. But what does it mean? It means that people, stubborn will that was reborn. They took also an active part an active role in the reconstruction. It was really proactive rather than a passive one. But even if we had this approach that was where it was as it was, the reconstruction, recompose destroyed villages, we respect the morphology, the physiognomies of tradition. The volumes and dimension were respected, but is still some unresolved questions. For instance, the social fabric in those years was not compact. The area that were destroyed were already suffering of the sprawl phenomenon, and somehow in the process of reconstruction, we witnessed this dichotomy that was the reconstruction of the old center, historical center, and the sort of urban sprawl that was, let's say, glued to a new area, and it was a sort of counterposition. It's often we talk about Fury as a model, but it was not a model. It was a project. It was a project because we were aware that in the year within, let's say, from 1970s something to 80s, probably we would be facing some problems related not only with the urban sprawl, but economy and the decline of rural areas. This decline and this economy's decrease was somehow delayed, but let's say that it was almost impossible to control this kind of reconstruction because we cannot really rebuild a territory with a polycentric structure that it could be maintained. But sometimes we face the fact that and we were frozen in stereotypes. However, the reconstruction was achieved in time and with the result that are still praiseworthy today. This is why it's called model. We go to another 6, but this time it was 6th of April. And in 2009, at 3:30 a.m., an earthquake of magnitude 6.3 hit in L'Aquila. You can see here the destruction that was left, and it left 300 victims and more than 1,600 injured, and 10 billion euros of estimated damages. Here you can see what was before and after the earthquake, what was the historical center and the cultural heritage. The response was immediate, and you can see how planned the Italian civil protection immediate reaction was the set and frame the tent camp for the evacuees, and it was quite efficient. But there is an acceleration, a strong one, of consumption of the soil with the low density buildings. We had here, there are some numbers about the Progetto Case. Progetto Case is the complex that were seismic against sustainable and compatible modules and houses. It was by law. We created 19 sites and we housed 15,000 of inhabitants, and with residential of 4,500, and the area occupied was 103 hectares. So there, the module, the temporary housing module map, there were 1,272 forms that housed 3,000 inhabitants, and the area occupies 27 hectares. Also, a really painful point for L'Aquila now is that the modules that were for a temporary use for school, the MASP, 25 sites, 5,500 students, and 16 hectares. This is a painful point because now, and I'm talking 2020, there is no reconstructed school in L'Aquila after more 11 years. So there's still, the MASP are still are still there in operation. One of the other effects as a result were the new urban forms, and the new forms were between a recomposition between morphologies and innovation. So you can see here, for instance, the difference in the two layers of the destroyed and historical part of the village and the new one. And you can understand that the relocation is somehow really invasive, respectively, to the old forms. And also, these are the temporary housing modules. They need some infrastructure to be rebuilt, roads, and facilities. So that was really occupying and consuming of the land. What was left is that on the cottages. Here there is a map where is shown how many buildings by law were allowed to be built temporary way. And there were just, I think, more than 1,500. The inhabitants are more than 3,500. And 42 hectares were occupied by provisional buildings, private, in the agricultural area. If we count how many people and what is the surface, etc., we can see that there is a small city of 20,000 inhabitants out of rules. Out of rules means out of plan, out of the PRG and so on. L'Aquila is trying to revive and to see and witness a new way after the reconstruction. Slowly is going to reform its life, but we have to recognize that L'Aquila and the reconstruction of it is a top-down approach, that it seems to be also the future of Amatrice. And the results, if you remember, I pointed out in the table, were an enormous detailed laws and norms, more than 200. Instead of this, when we talk about multi-level governance, we can decrease this number of regulation. But however, to do this, it requires a lot of negotiation, coordination processes, and we have to involve as much as possible all the parties and stakeholders. It means that they're really heterogeneous. It increased the time that is needed for the reconstruction, but once started, it's accelerated the process. And also thinking about that participation, enable administration to avoid conflict, keep solutions realistic, why decisions are made and executed at the central level, could be really more fast and apparently really efficient. We have seen in the temporary housing in L'Aquila, but in long-term perspective, they lead to conflict, as well as under or overestimation, like in the cottages, for instance, for L'Aquila, of consuming of resources. So what we learn from this example, that as long as communities in the disaster-prone areas perceive the risk and they keep increasing the level of the adaptability, the risk awareness will foster their ability to come up with innovative strategies to live with the risk. And such innovative restoration strategies shall increase resilience without losing the traces of the past. Who can say that if the future of the reconstructed L'Aquila be smart or not? Right now is difficult to think. Also, if we think about the central Italy earthquake that struck in 2000, an important area in 2016 and 17. And the problem is that this area is divided among different regions in an area that is aging. The 28% of the population in Europe is over 60 years old, more the national average. And the average income per capita is 78% of the national average. And all the economy of the area is based on agriculture. And also it includes the 50% of the area is protected by natural low park and is a low density. So what will be the future of this? This is quite difficult to predict because, for instance, if we think about reconstruction, it's quite difficult, as you can see here. The damage, the destruction that was shown now just leave debris and ruin. And it shows that it's really difficult to balance the reconstruction properly of buildings that are probably they were weak since they were old, and they were not following, not retrofitted, not following the updating building code. But Emilia, for instance, is showing us how to govern the reconstruction, dealing with the process. So we have to engage community in the disaster recovery process, and we need to mutually build disaster recovery plan. So even once rebuilt, the history shows us that planners, designers, architects, engineers, stakeholders in general, communities should dedicate their attention to spaces, places, and infrastructure that could remain vulnerable, even if rebuilt. And it's necessary to secure not only the resilience, but also the resistance of them, to support processes of inclusive reconstruction based on risk awareness of local communities. Because, as we said at the beginning, this approach stimulates innovative types of recovery regeneration that could enhance resilience without losing continuity and traces with the past. So there are different modules, approaches to think about, different views or perspective to look at the question of topic of historical center that can be under risk or prone to disaster. One is the way how we look at the historical center, is the passion, as Pierluigi Ciabellati is saying here. So it's something to look at it like to preserve. If you remember, we divided into adaptive to conservation. That is fine, but we cannot look at it anymore in this way. We have to understand that we have to keep the memory and to maintain that urban scenario that is a physical shape of the city, but conceiving it as part that cannot be left to, to dissolve in the modern city. And in the Germans say here that it's something that you have to remember, that the value, that the symbolic value is independent from the economic value of urban heritage. But who is responsible for the conservation, and who is the owner of the built environment? The legal owner, the users, the state, a community that must be defined. The answer, according with government, is really simple. Is the responsibility is to whom recognize the symbolic value of this environment. So we can look to the future, and I really love this quotation by Alvin Toffler. He said that by making imaginative use of change to channel change, we can not only spare ourselves the trauma of future shock, we can reach out and humanize distant tomorrows. So it's the only way probably that we have to keep and save and preserve and maintain, but with an eye on the transformation and the urban transformation in the future, our cultural historical heritage. Thank you. We'll go to the fifth and last part of this sector.